Okay. Hi, everyone. I'm Katie McCarthy with the Juvenile Justice Information Exchange, a nonprofit news organization for people who care about children and the law. Thank you for joining us today for this video chat on evidence-based practices and juvenile justice. We're going to be talking today with Jeffrey Butts, the Director of Research and Evaluation Center at the John Jay College of Criminal Justice at the City University of New York, and Cynthia Lum, Associate Professor, Department of Criminology, Law and Society, and Director of the Center for Evidence-Based Crime Policy at George Mason University. As you may know, last Wednesday, August 13th, we launched the next section of our Juvenile Justice Resource Hub on evidence-based practices, comprised of material developed and curated by the National Juvenile Justice Network. It's chock full of the most recent research, cutting-edge reforms, model policies, links to experts, toolkits for taking action, and more. Please check it out. Here's our URL. Okay, and if you have questions today, please ask them via Twitter now using the hashtag evidence-based. And I will be scanning Twitter, taking your questions, looking forward to those. Without further ado, let's dive in. And actually, Cynthia and Jeffrey, first, if you guys want to briefly introduce yourselves so everybody knows who you are. We'll start with Cynthia. Maybe give a quick background.
Well, Katie, I think you did a great job. I'm at George Mason University. It's a large public university in Northern Virginia within the Department of Criminology, Law and Society. Very happy to be here representing also the Center for Evidence-Based Crime Policy at George Mason.
Great.
Okay, and I'm Jeffrey Butts. I'm at John Jay College here in New York City at the City University of New York. And I started off in life as a social worker, actually doing something productive for young people, and then I got into the research field. And since then I've been focused on hopefully practical writings and studies that can help direct practitioners towards more effective practices. So I think overlap the areas of practice and research.
Great. Well, we're really happy to have you guys. So to start off, let's dive into what it means to be an evidence-based practice. Can you explain the vetting approval process for a program or modality to be considered evidence-based? A general overview for people who don't really know what it means to be evidence-based. We can start with Jeffrey.
Okay. Well, I'm sure Cynthia would have a more detailed answer, but I'll give you my impressions that there are different ways people think of evidence-based programs and also increasingly practices and what that means. The clumsy, less helpful way is to think of these as a finite set of programs that are in someone's list or someone's compendium on a website. And you go to that website and you look up which things are evidence-based and which things are not. And as soon as you find 2 or 3 that you can afford, you're done. That's what I would call clumsy or crude evidence-based practices. The more helpful way to think about it is as a continuum or even a developmental journey of becoming more and more evidence-oriented, evidence-informed, no matter what your practices are, collecting data that will allow you to judge their efficacy, their impact on your intended goals. And an evidence-based program or practice is something that has taken that journey quite some ways and has started to collect stronger and stronger evidence to the point that it's really impossible to think of it as misdirected or ineffective or harmful. There's just too much evidence on the side of helpfulness and effectiveness to reject it. So it's the one thing I would say is evidence-based practices is not a 2-category variable where you either are or you aren't. It's all shades of gray, and hopefully people continue to pursue the evidence and make their practices stronger and stronger.
And Cynthia, did you want to add to that?
I couldn't agree with Jeffrey more. It's the question itself is not, is something evidence-based? Is an agency evidence-based? it's really much more complex and nuanced than the question implies. And I say this because it's really important in this area to think broadly about what it means to pursue practices that are evidence-based or to be evidence-based. I think it's an exchange between kind of the supply of research and the demand for research and everything in between. So translation of that research, partnerships between research and practitioners, the use and the receptivity of the research in practice, some obstacles to that, challenges to that. It's kind of a lifestyle question for the agency, you know, in terms of its overall practices, its overall portfolio, and how it perceives science, for example, or the use of data or descriptive information, even in an agency's everyday work. So I think it's much more broader than just to say, you know, one thing is evidence-based, or you are evidence-based, or you're not evidence-based. And I think Jeffrey also points out a very important point, that it's the totality of evidence. It's like a building of evidence around a particular area that's important. It's not just a single study that makes a intervention evidence-based or not.
So it's much more complicated than the question and basic understanding implies. Can you guys go into some of those challenges and misunderstandings with evidence-based practices and the concept of something being evidence-based as a whole? Cynthia?
Wow, okay, where to start? I think, just to give an example, I suppose, I work a lot with police agencies, and I apologize for those of you who are calling in. I'm going to be referring a little bit to the policing world, just because that's the area that I know well. But sometimes we go into a police agency and they're stuck on using a particular intervention to reduce crime through their patrol operations or something like that. And they're stuck on it because they feel like we have to do this because it was in this one study, and somebody said this thing was a very good study, and therefore we have to replicate this in our agency. Well, you know, there could be many factors in the agency that make that intervention in that study not relevant necessarily to this particular agency. And so getting agencies to be a little bit more flexible with how they view science or how they view research outputs is one challenge. It's kind of a double-edged sword, because I think if I were a criminal justice agency, I need an answer. You know, I want an answer, and I want to do something that's going to help, and I want a solution. The problem is that, as we know, science is a little bit more messy. There's many factors that go into whether or not a program is effective, and it's not a cookie-cutter approach that makes evidence-based approach happen. I think there's also another misunderstanding, sometimes among academics, that evidence-based crime policy equals randomized controlled experiment, for example. Sometimes you can't do experiments to evaluate interventions. It doesn't mean that that knowledge is any less valuable. And so I think understanding that the evidence behind evidence-based is not just about intervention or evaluation knowledge, it's also about descriptive knowledge, statistical knowledge, qualitative information that can be very helpful. A colleague of mine, Nick Fife, calls it a plurality of knowledge that that we should be receptive to in terms of allowing science into governance. So just a couple of things, among other things, culture and things like that, I'm sure Jeffrey will talk about, that make it difficult to bring science into practice.
It's really when people try to take this concept and use it in practice and then implement it in ways that will allow them to trust that it will be sustainable, that you run into problems. And I pointed out two things actually when I do talks on this that always either frustrate me or tend to break my heart. And one of them, the heartbreaking one, is when programs that I've come to really admire their approach, I admire their innovative qualities, and I really think based upon theoretical understanding or just substantive understanding, particularly in the youth field, of what would help young people stay out of a criminal lifestyle. And I really like their approach. And then I hear that they're abandoning some of their core concepts because they're getting pressure to be evidence-based. And that's one of the problems, that we have this rush to become protected by the label evidence-based, protected from funding interruptions, competition over contracts, and people are in a panic and they rush out and just adapt whatever seems to be called evidence-based, even if it doesn't fit their model, even if it doesn't fit their own experiences and their own beliefs in what's effective. And the other thing that breaks my heart or frustrates me is when policymakers or legislators use a sledgehammer to coerce this behavior by passing laws that say if you are not an evidence-based program, which usually means you're not on one of the national registers of evidence-based programs. If we can't find you there, you are ineligible for funding, which just reinforces this behavior. And I just wish states would be more sophisticated. And I once asked a state official who was in one of these states that passed a law like this, expressed concern about the damaging effect this would have. And he said, oh, no, don't worry. We've put in a provision for innovation. We give people up to a year to become evidence-based, which just made me want to cry. Because if you really know programming and really know intervention practices, you know it takes a while. Not only, it takes a while, first of all, just to discover what you think is effective, then to stabilize it, then to routinize the data collection, and then you have follow-up periods. Most of these programs deal with a few dozen clients at any one time, the community-based programs I'm thinking of, and to have a good, rigorous evaluation design with sufficient sample size to really draw some strong inferences about impact, it takes a number of years and follow-up. So it's the crude way these ideas are implemented that's frustrating to people like me. It's not the concept or the goal of becoming evidence-based. It's when people are in a rush and use it to their advantage for competitive purposes and marketing purposes.
Yeah, becomes too black and white to the exclusion of some important programs.
The image I give people sometimes, it's like we're all on a big cruise ship and someone says, look over there, and everyone rushes over to that side of the ship and the whole thing starts to tilt over. Someone says, oh, cognitive behavioral therapy, let's all go do cognitive behavioral therapy. It's just harder to maintain a balance in a competitive environment.
Are there other ways that we can evaluate various programs and interventions that are gaining traction or comparable, or how else do we evaluate an intervention or a program? Jeffrey or Cynthia can grab that one.
Well, Cynthia already alluded to the mixed methods or having a plurality of evidence, meaning one study might be completely qualitative, so that someone has a good program, someone who's a researcher and who has the independence to really look at things objectively goes and watches the program in operation and writes up notes about it and says, this seems to be great, I see all these clients coming in, they leave, I can see social skills being acquired, I can see their family relationships improving, or it's a different kind of program and they can just feel that the neighborhood is safer. People talk about, I don't care what the recidivism rate is, I see people sitting on their porches at night, and that didn't happen here 5 years ago. That, no one did an experimental design yet, but that could be important evidence. And again, you can go up a level from there and have something which is a comparison study. So it's not a random controlled trial where you carefully control all conditions on both sides, either treatment or control. It could be something like you have 6 communities that do this practice and 6 communities that are just like them in almost every way and don't do the practice, and then you see if there's a difference. That would not stand up to the most rigorous standard of science, but if those 6 communities that do this practice have a distinct, measurable improvement on some goal, and the 6 that don't do it do not improve, that's a reason to continue to invest in the model and continue to explore it. So you have lots of choices along the path to being the highest standard of evidence.
Yeah, I give a couple of examples. I'm sorry, there's like a little gnat flying around here. Let me give a couple of examples. You know, many people like to evaluate interventions, and they want some kind of comparison group. You see some of the smart policing programs that come out, they encourage comparison groups, which is good. It's a very positive thing. But at the same time, you can have, for example, very good time series analyses in which you don't necessarily have a comparison group in that sense, but that you can really gain very good knowledge about the effect of an intervention. And so, you know, thinking about, a lot of times as evaluation researchers, we tend to try to weigh, or not really weigh, try to improve the way we're doing evaluation to increase its internal or external validities, you know. But at the same time, some things are that seem to be better, like a comparison group study, may not always be. You can have a really bad experiment, for example. I also want to reiterate something that Jeffrey talked about with mixed methods. Evaluation work is not just about the result. You know, for example, hotspots policing. When you put police in a hotspot, does it reduce crime? Yes, it could very well reduce crime, but the police are interested in what should the police do when they're in the hotspot, and sometimes that kind of information gets lost in the final result, right? And so being able to document that through observations, through interviews, through focus groups, talking to officers to see, will they be willing to do this in the future? Maybe they're willing to do it now because their chief told them you have to do this evaluation. But the real question for evidence-based approach, which I'd like to return to what I started with, is, you know, will an agency or will an individual working in an agency be willing to adopt this type of practice? Do they believe in it? Will they institutionalize it into their everyday work? These are really important questions in terms of the overall paradigm of being more evidence-based. And to get at those questions, you need different types of methods, different types of approaches, different types of ways to study a research question.
It's also important to be aware of the things we exempt from this conversation. There are practices and programs that we never question whether they're evidence-based or not. We just think, oh, you have to do that. I mean, no one's ever done random controlled trials or even rigorous studies on a lot of things that happen in prison, even a lot of policing practices. We just do them because it's the culture of policing. We've always done it that way.
Yes.
We tend to impose the scrutiny of the evidence-based conversation on new things or things that aren't necessarily affiliated with the sort of the central mechanisms of crime control. So things that sound squishier or things that sound more treatment-oriented or more community-based, that's where we go to say, oh, no, you have to be evidence-based. But you're running the state prison and putting people in solitary? Oh, well, of course you have to do that. We're not going to expect you to have evidence that that's effective. And that runs across the gamut. I think a lot of this evidence-based discussion is often used like a sledgehammer out of ideological reasons, and people have to speak up who are in a position to be more informed on this issue and defend some smaller ideas or more innovative ideas.
How do you see this progressing? Do you see smaller organizations or grassroots interventions sort of falling by the wayside or not being able to keep up? Like, is the direction going that funding, particularly federal funding, is definitely going towards evidence-based because of the natural appeal of saying something is scientifically sort of vetted? What can be done, or what's going on, or who's sort of getting on the soapbox for the little guys?
Can I tell one story, Cynthia, and then I'll... So
Please.
the one story is not in the crime field, but I was in D.C. a while ago visiting some federal officials in different agencies talking about this very thing, about evidence-based practices and policy. And we were meeting with some people. I forget the acronyms in HHS because there are too many of them, but it was ASPE or part of ASPE, or it's the research people in HHS who deal with foster care. They were describing to me, maybe you know about this, some major federal pot of money that was available a couple of years ago, millions and millions of dollars that states could apply for. And there was a set aside for innovative practices. So states were given the option. You could apply for something that had already been ordained as evidence-based, or you could apply for something that was more innovative and put the work in yourself to help move that along and to build out that program and do research on it. The split was 3-to-1. So there was, and it was millions of dollars. So states could apply for this big pot of money that was 75% of the funds, or 25% of it was set aside for innovation. And of all 50 states applied, only 5 even bothered to write an application for the innovative segment. So a quarter of all this money was set aside for innovation, and only 10% of the states even bothered to apply. And I think that, to me, is a measurable indicator of the overall problem.
Yeah, I always see this, the evidence-based crime policy venture as, I think social scientists call this a wicked problem, where everything has to move together at once, right? And everything has to change together at once. So you know, look, sometimes we need the funding, the messaging at the federal level and at the state level to make some broader impact and to push the idea forward more generally. At the same time, you have exactly what Jeffrey and I are talking about, which is, you know, the nuances get lost, and sometimes those nuances are extremely important to the everyday practices, and also what people think about is evidence-based approach, you know, because if it becomes a fad and they just lock onto it because, you know, they're trying to get funding, then everything is lost, because really what's important is the education of why science and scientific processes are so important when we think about democratic governance, right? So those are really important, but they get lost because we have to have someone taking a leadership level and saying, hey, let's fund some of this, or here's what evidence-based approach is. And it's not just at the top levels that this is occurring. All the translators at the local levels are also saying a really kind of crude version of what evidence-based policing is. Even Jeffrey and I just talking here today, we could probably go on for 8 hours about this subject, about what is evidence-based crime policy. And then by the end of the 8 hours, we'll together come up with kind of a what is it, right? Because there's so many different aspects of it. So to answer your question in a roundabout way, Katie, it's like some of the effort has to be at the federal and state levels, and they have to be sophisticated in the way they're messaging, right? Some of the effort has to be at Jeffrey and my levels, where we're actually working with people on the ground and conveying this more detailed, nuanced education. Some of it comes from other organizations, you know, who are trying to consolidate research. You know, like Campbell Collaboration is trying to consolidate research, or Jeffrey has, he was talking to me about evidencegeneration.org, right? That these are places where you're trying to consolidate research to get people to have some kind of, you know, look at the research. Just turn their eyes towards research, you know. It takes a lot of multi-level effort by various people and in various ways. That sergeant who is in charge of a patrol unit in my local police department down the street, if he or she says, you know what, I'm just doing this because the chief said to do it, I don't really believe in it, I don't even know what it is, that alone will undo everything that the federal or state or Jeffrey and me and our colleagues are working towards. Just that one line. So changing that has to also be a goal.
And you have to understand the position or the perception of a local practitioner at the city, county, or even state level. They don't have a bunch of people sitting around reading studies for them and compiling the evidence and advising them on the rigor of the results. They really do need something that they can hold on to and use. So it's understandable that they go for these quick, easy answers. But they need partners. Cynthia and I have talked before about the need for research partners at the local county level, because there are a lot of smart people in this field, but they all work in different places in different cities, and not every community college has someone available and talented enough to help out the local police department or the local probation department or social services. So you need to develop those relationships over time and turn your local potential expert into an actual expert, and that takes time. One of the things I love that the federal government does is set aside money for researcher practitioner partnerships. Occasionally they put out a solicitation where to get the money you have to show a relationship between the researcher and the agency or the practitioner. And that's very, very productive, especially if people form those partnerships in anticipation of application rather than in a big rush for the new solicitation. Because everyone needs to work with someone locally who's available to them, who can say, let me explain this design to you. It sounds fancy, but it actually is just fancy statistics to cover up for the fact they have really bad data. And let me explain how that works. And then other things that sound really simple, how could this be research? It sounds so easy, might be very powerful. And everyone needs, I think, Cynthia, you said something before about translation. Everyone needs that translation service.
To that end, to people who are still feeling like evidence-based is a little bit up in the clouds, I'm really liking some of the anecdotes you guys are giving. Cynthia, could you kind of give another anecdote to us, a sort of a facet of your work that you've seen on the ground where someone has really incorporated some sort of understanding of the science behind their work in a way that has completely sort of changed how they've interacted with their work and maybe the kids that they work with?
Sure. Well, again, I can talk about policing, but I can also mention things like juvenile diversion, which is, becoming, people are becoming more knowledgeable about this in policing, right? But I think the best way to put this is, from the totality of the policing literature, we tend to, there are some principles that we think if you move towards those principles, you're more likely to see a positive outcome. And that's, to me, what means to be evidence-based, not necessarily following a specific study, but thinking about these principles more generally. And just 3 of the principles that in policing are being more proactive. So police have generally been much more reactive in their approach. They answer 911 calls, for example. They get a call for a problem juvenile, they show up and they make an arrest, right? It's a reactive approach to policing. Being more focused and targeted. So you're not going to deal with a juvenile issue the same way that you might deal with an adult issue in policing. In fact, there is now research talking about and this is not research that I'm well familiar with, and I think Jeffrey could probably speak to this more, but talking about the development of the teenage brain, the interactions that young people have with adults that they're not quite formed, there's maturity issues, etc., right? And so in any case, being more focused, being more targeted, being more tailored to the particular problem at hand, we know can be more effective. And also finally in policing, instead of focusing on individuals, focusing on places and specific communities has shown to be a more promising approach. So having said that, to answer your question, Katie, the agencies that I see that are moving towards a more evidence-based approach tend to change something about their patrol into those 3 areas, all right? So instead of being a 911 responder, which is most police, they have an officer that handles a beat. That beat, they respond to 911 calls, and they do random preventative patrol, right? Instead of doing that, they might, for example, focus on a very specific problem in a specific community and work with somebody in that community to try to figure out an answer to this. One of my colleagues, Dr. Gill, is working on this with Seattle communities to try to reduce youth violence in those communities. And so they see a particular problem, they analyze that particular problem, what is the root of that, what is the nature of that issue, and then working with somebody to come up with some tailored response. So I think in policing, you're seeing evidence of some agencies trying to change up their reactive approach to this type of proactive, focused, community-oriented, place-based approach. And I mean, there's a wide variety of ways they're doing this, but often it's a very small step. It may not even, it's like a blip on, it won't make the news, but it is a change in their kind of everyday deployment of just response, 911 response.
In some ways, it's just as much of a struggle to stop the proliferation of practices. Think about how hard it's been to finally kill off the scared straight concept. There were enough studies that came out.
Still not killed off yet.
I know, exactly. Or, you know, I guess the better example would be the, what's the police bring the drugs in the school program? I'm just blanking on the name.
DARE.
Yes. So we had DARE. Some initial analyses came out that showed actually it sort of lessens the stigma of drug use and might increase curiosity about drugs. So that program at first freaked out that they had a negative finding and first pushed back politically and marketing and tried to just defend themselves. And then they said, okay, we just can't do that anymore. So they started trying to change around some of their practices and I guess move it in the direction of more effectiveness. So that's an example where the research actually worked. There are other things that seem to be impervious to research findings. And partly, right now we're in a very difficult period because crime has been coming down so much all over the country that any idiot with an idea can claim to have brought crime down. So I always make the joke when I'm doing talks like, if I were just, you know, teaching kids to play the guitar over the last 10 years, I could say that I brought down the crime rate because look, I started teaching guitar and crime was here and now it's way down here, so I must be doing a great job. So elected officials, I understand the pressure to claim success, and so a lot of them do that, but someone needs to say, whoa, wait a minute, let's look at some of the, what Cynthia and I might call counterfactuals. Let's look at crime is down in the community 20 miles away from you too. Do you have guitar students over there? So someone has to start asking the tough questions about what makes up evidence. And of course, practitioners hate that when we do that because we're spoiling their party. But in order to be truly evidence-based, someone has to ask those difficult questions about any practice. And it just takes a while for all that to sort through. And it's also hard to insulate all that from politics. So if an idea has a lot of power behind it and there's a lot of money to be made by someone who likes that idea and there's enough elected officials who are behind it, it's really hard to stop a bad practice. So even though sometimes I come off as being a skeptic about evidence-based policy and practice, it's only because I think it's only because I have such hopes for the field that we become more evidence-oriented, and I get frustrated when it's done clumsily or sort of transparently, with transparent self-interest among some of the players.
I want to get back to that, but we have a quick question from Twitter from Leonard Witt. Can Jeffrey provide a real example of researcher-practitioner partnership? Thank you, Leonard.
Okay. The easiest thing for me to think of is my own. So I started working with the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation's initiative 10 years ago called Reclaiming Futures. And they initially, of course, I applied for this work as the outside evaluator. And I think I was the outside evaluator for about 8 months. And after going to meetings with them and sitting with the sites, this was 10 communities around the country that were trying to blend more effectively their substance abuse treatment community with their juvenile justice community. And I just kept hearing all these things that didn't make sense to me. And I've told people this story before that I remember, I can picture myself in the room where I sort of crossed over and gave up my status as outsider and actually started to solve problems with them. And that turned out to be a really satisfying career experience for me because they were completely open to that. And we had to keep reassuring the foundation that I hadn't lost my objectivity, that I was just working with the sites to try to come up with better information. And I think if the one advice I would give to local officials and practitioners, if you are working with a researcher who continues to act like they are outside, doesn't show their hands, doesn't talk to you honestly, always keeps their notebooks or their laptops, only visible to themselves, metaphorically, keeping the information away from you, that may not be a partner. Now, sometimes that's a good role to have because it can come up. You can generate really strong information by someone who's completely disinterested in the success of your program. And I've actually offered my services to people before. I'll give you an example. Youth advocate programs came to our center about 4 years ago and said, would you evaluate us? We need to become evidence-based. And I remember I said to Jeff Fleischer, the president, no, I don't want to do that because I like your program too much. I love your model. And I don't want to just come in and collect data to see if it turns out to be effective. I'd rather work with you as a partner to build up your data collection strategies and your orientation to information to the point where we are all completely confident that if you got someone who came in here one day to evaluate you, you'd be strong. And we've been doing that for 4 years, and that's been a great experience. Sorry for the long answer.
No, that's great. That's really, I've been reading into youth advocate programs and sort of listening to some of Shayna's thoughts on, I mean, she particularly brought up the quote for me the first time of like, you know what, like juvenile justice and incarceration, like that's not an evidence-based practice. And I think listening to her approach of like evaluating their impressions on kids and not being limited to formal empirical data was good, was important. Let's see. What else?
I would just add that in terms of partnerships, some of the best partnerships in which I've learned how to be a better partner have come from practitioners who just want to partner with me on kind of a one-on-one discussion basis. It's like a very informal, pick up the phone, hey, we've got this particular problem, crime problem. Do you know anything about it? Or can you give me an idea of something different than we're talking about in our management meetings? And those just one-on-one exchanges can lead to more formal partnerships with purpose, things that where you're trying to do a grant or something like this. But I feel like those are the most valuable, at least for me, as the research partner, to learn how to be a better partner, just to learn how to think more carefully about what's the needs of the agency, not what are my personal research needs, right, or publication needs or something like that. And so those are really important. If there are young researchers listening, I would say, just have a one-on-one partnership with somebody. It can even be an officer. It doesn't have to be the chief of police, right, or somebody high up in the state government.
Just quickly, where can practitioners sort of create those connections? How can those people best link up? I mean, we have our resource hub that just launched last week, jjie.org/hub, and we have a new section on evidence-based practice, and we have links to experts. How else can practitioners sort of connect with people who are doing the research and might have some information to share?
I guess I'll give 3 answers to that really quickly. One is that we've developed what we call the E-Consortium. It's meant to connect university scholars and researchers who often are not well connected to the practice field. And you can just go to the E-Consortium and find a person in a local university nearby you who has interest in your area. So there's that tool. I would also say to networking at conferences and at meetings is really important. A number of partners that I've come to have very close relationships with in terms of doing work in police agencies or what have you, have really just come out of going to ISCP conference or going to ASC, giving a presentation, talking to people, presenting to groups that would like to hear about a particular project or something like that. I forget my third one. I'll turn over to Jeffrey. I forgot my third one.
And also social media. My center is using LinkedIn a lot more. We established a corporate page on LinkedIn rather than just personal pages. And then you mentioned, Katie, the JJIE hub. I'm sure JJIE would be thrilled if comment fields turned out to be used. There you go. Go to that hub, look at the comments, look at articles. All of us, I'm sure Cynthia would agree, we may not have time to help you directly, but if we notice that the email's coming from someone in Oklahoma, and we know someone who's in Oklahoma and works in the field, we might steer them away. So that social networking thing is also very helpful.
Okay, if you are just joining us, I'm Katie McCarthy with the JJIE, and we are talking right now with Jeffrey Butts and Cynthia Lum about evidence-based practices. We have a few more minutes here. If you have a question, ask it via Twitter, #evidence-based. We've been having a really good chat, a lot of information here, definitely eye-opening in terms of what it means to pay attention, ask good questions, be flexible, and use science and research on the ground to make the best choices. Let's see, other questions I have here. You guys have really gone through it and answered so much of my unanswered stuff. I think, let's see.
Could I bring up a topic while you're reading?
Yeah, please do.
Right.
Please do.
I'd like to bring up one more thing, which is something that always irks me. I often use the phrase in doing talks on this, reminding people that evidence is purchased, not discovered. That we only get high-quality evidence when you have resources and talent coming together with opportunity. And sometimes that can be expensive. It's at least complicated, if not expensive. And that there's in the juvenile justice field, I'll just speak for that field, I always remind people there's a reason that if you think about evidence-based practice and policies being a race, like people trying to get across, the finish line to become recognized, there's a reason why some of the programs that cross the finish line first are things like functional family therapy, multi-systemic therapy, multidimensional treatment foster care. These are all things where the model itself depends on the delivery of interventions at the individual level. That you can do a fairly controlled trial or controlled study on individual level service delivery, in which, especially with MST and FFT, where it's actually a therapeutic exchange where you could content code the exchange, you can record all the data, you can get a very good measure of the extent to which that person participated in the model or not, or completed the program. And so it's more readily evaluable. Compare that to something like a project I'm working on right now, the Cure Violence model of violence reduction, where you're out in the community and doing violence interruption with former offenders, and part of the model is anonymity. You don't want to force people to tell you their real names. Depends upon quick personal interactions on the street, sometimes at 4 in the morning in a city park. How do you do a controlled trial on that? How do you do the random assignment studies that you would require to get across the finish line first? It does not mean that that program is ineffective. It just means it's harder to evaluate. It takes more resources, takes more creativity. So I think people often make the mistake of thinking that because we have 4 or 5 things that are called evidence-based, they must be the best. Because they came up first on those registers, they're the best program. And it could be a disastrous mistake because, again, remember my metaphor of everyone running over to one side of the cruise ship. We don't want to turn the justice system into a massive psychotherapy program. We have to maintain a balance. And it's up to us as researchers to continue to work on those programs, but sometimes we have a hard time developing the resources to do that for the same reason practitioners often have a hard time getting contracts. Funders and contractors want quick payoff, and they want to place their bets on something that they know will win. And you go to them with a big murky program that's going to take 10 years to evaluate, they start to lose interest.
Yeah, a very good point. Good metaphor with the cure violence. It seems like programs that are on the streets in particular, maybe more interacting with people in the world and not in a therapeutic modality, are definitely a lot harder to evaluate. Human-to-human interaction is difficult to glean data from. Cynthia, do you have anything else to add before we sort of wrap it up here?
No, I think we've covered a lot of ground here. I would say that we should think more, just, we shouldn't focus so much on, is this practice evidence-based? It is an important question, but the question is more like, you know, how can, especially we talk about agencies, criminal justice agencies or juvenile justice agencies, how can they become more oriented towards not just the knowledge or the evidence about crime, interventions, etc., but also more receptive to people that are generating that information, either inside of their agency or outside of their agency. And it's also about kind of finding some equilibrium between a good supply of that evidence and the demand for that evidence, and that involves a translation element, digestible, you know, generating information that's digestible and that's usable. And it also involves a cultural element of the agencies and also the academic. I mean, I'm speaking as an academic because that's, you know, but also research agencies. You know, for both sides of the supply and demand for research to really understand kind of a cultural shift in terms of being more involved in this type of venture, because academics were not always involved in trying to generate evidence for practical knowledge necessarily. So the question, we have to move away from, you know, is X evidence-based, right? And more of, you know, how can we become more more oriented to knowledge exchange, translation, receptivity, change of culture, institutionalization of knowledge. Why do we in modern democracies care about science in governance? That's also a very important philosophical question that we need to be asking ourselves. And I know that's a lot to ask in a world where funding is based on single questions, or we're so focused on the goal or the outcome. But I would just ask everyone to keep those questions in mind so we become more sophisticated about the way we think about knowledge and its role in governance.
Definitely. Well, I have to wrap us up here. It is 12:45, 3:45 PST. Thank you, Cynthia and Jeffrey, for sharing your expertise. That was fantastic.
Yeah.
And thank you to everyone for tuning in. As a reminder, if you want to watch this again, I know it was dense, or if you missed something, it's going to be archived at jjie.org, as well as JJIE's YouTube channel. And again, for more information, if you've got lingering questions or you want to be connected to more resources, please visit our resource hub, jjie.org/hub. We just launched our evidence-based section. Amazing resource, recent research, cutting-edge reforms, model policies, kind of delving into some of the bigger questions and some of the concepts we've talked about today, as well as outside links that I think would be really helpful. So, thank you, Cynthia and Jeffrey, and we'll see you guys next time.
Okay.
Bye.
Take care.
Bye.